Welcome. This is Resilience Radio, and I'm Irvin Eisenberg. Today's guest is Jeremy Lesniak. He is the owner of Central Vermont Martial Arts. And a personal disclaimer, I attend this school, and so he is my sensei as well. It's great to have you on, Jeremy.
Thanks. It's good to be back. You know, it's one of the things that I love about Central Vermont is that it's rare you only have one relationship with someone, right? Like, you know them in like a couple different ways, you know, and when I think over the years, like, I've known you in a bunch of ways. And so that's just fun. And I appreciate the invitation so we can talk about this thing that I'm so passionate about.
Yeah, so you have a lot of background in martial arts prior to this school. And we had you on before talking about movement in general and a little bit of martial arts stuff. What led you to do your school now?
Yeah. So it's funny because professionally, much of my time is taken up in the world of martial arts. And so people would ask me, oh, what do you do? And I tell them a little bit, you know, I have a martial arts company. They'd say, oh, you have a school? No. And prior to opening CVMA, it was like the one thing you could do with martial arts that I wasn't doing. And what prompted this now, I had a school 20 years ago and I enjoyed it, but I focused on other aspects of my career. At the time, martial arts was a passion, a hobby, a lifestyle. But I've started running into theories that I wanted to test with, quote, live students, you know, traveling around the country and giving seminars, and people started asking me questions. Well, you know, how does this stuff start to work and translate when it's happening on an ongoing basis? It's one thing you've come and you've worked with us for an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours, but how does this stuff start to manifest when it's happening week after week after week? And if you know anything about me, I don't like unanswered questions. So I spent some time thinking, okay, how would that go? And put together in the world of martial arts anyway, a rather revolutionary curriculum and approach. And now we're here.
So before delving too much into your school and what makes it the curriculum revolutionary, why should the average person care about martial arts?
If we look at the modern landscape, traditional martial arts training is the puzzle piece that fits in most perfectly with where people are lacking. There are a lot of things that are not a secret in our world. 3/4 of the population are obese or overweight. If you have children in public school, you probably have some thoughts on discipline and cause and effect. There's probably, you know, it doesn't take long in any social dynamic, whether it's online or in person, to see that respect seems to be a bit lacking these days. These are all things that are inherently baked into traditional martial arts training. So when we look at that, it's kind of the perfect prescription for what most people need in the world today. And done well, it's kind of an efficient solution.
So I find it interesting that most people, I feel like when they think of martial arts, they either think, okay, that's really learning how to hurt people, or that's where you send your child to learn some discipline.
Yeah. Because somehow when people become older, they don't need discipline. In fact, I would argue that it gets worse for most people with age once you get the self-determination. You know, and you look at that, most people, I'm choosing my words carefully because I want to be careful in not offending any of the folks that are listening, because if I offend them, they'll turn it off and they won't hear any of the wonderful things that we're going to talk about. But if you look at the people around you, forget about looking in the mirror, put yourself aside for a moment. Most people would benefit from more discipline. I don't think I've ever met a person who said, I have too much discipline. I have too much self-respect. I have too much self-esteem. I am too healthy, right? These are things that we can always have more of. And while there are folks who look and say, yes, martial arts is violent, we can talk about that if you want to. And there are folks who think it is for kids. And that's actually one of the things that I do in my professional career is I support the martial arts industry. And to be specific, the traditional martial arts industry. And I draw a line there versus, say, mixed martial arts, the stuff that you see on TV with the UFC. That's not what I do. It's not what I advocate for. It's not what I'm involved in. I'm not disparaging it. It's just very different in the same way that, say, football and rugby are very different, or in the way that ballet and tap dancing are different, right? They're if you look very quickly, they can look similar, but they are quite different. And the benefits that we espouse as an industry for children, those benefits don't suddenly stop being relevant at 18 or 16 or wherever you choose to draw that age line. And I wish more people were open-minded enough to ask the questions that will lead to the answers that lead to them giving it a try.
And I think I've heard you say before that you wish everyone had 6 months of martial arts training.
Yeah.
Why?
As you might imagine, when I talk to people, when they find out that I'm actively engaged in martial arts, they will often say, oh yeah, I did, a year of karate when I was a kid, or taekwondo, or whatever. They did some manner of martial art 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And they talk about it in this very positive, reminiscent way. I don't hear people talk about 6 months of soccer or a season of tennis or football in the same way. Not to say that that doesn't happen, but it's almost universal. I've never had anyone come to me and say, I did a couple years of karate when I was 7, and I wish I'd never done it. In fact, what I tend to hear more of is, I did 6 months of whatever when I was a kid, and it was really good for me, and I want my child to do that too.
So we sort of put in the plug for martial arts in general, and I know that you started this so that you, as a sort of a testing ground, and I'm being one of your guinea pigs.
You are very much a guinea pig. You even seem to be growing the fur.
Yes. I'll have to work on my squeak. So what are we testing? What are you testing out? What's different about this school?
So if we roll back probably 10 years ago when I started this company, and by the way, the company is called Whistlekick, and we are a global entity primarily serving English-speaking countries in the world, and primarily just because of proximity. Most of what we do happens to be in the US, but we have people that engage with what we do from all over. As I started the company, people would ask me, well, what do you do? And what they really meant was, what is your niche within the world of martial arts? And at the time, I'd been training for about 30 years, and I realized it was kind of odd that I didn't have a niche. And if anything, my niche was that I didn't have a niche, and you could drop me into pretty much any martial arts school, regardless of what the style was, and I could train and I could learn and often even share and benefit the folks there. And that was really cool. And I still love that about myself and my martial arts upbringing. But as the company developed, I started traveling around, and people would say, well, teach my students something. And what I found that I was very passionate about and skilled at in a way that a lot of others weren't, was in how to teach. See, in the martial arts world, one of the things that we often get wrong is that just because you know how to do something doesn't mean you know how to teach it. In most sports, we recognize, okay, that person is an athlete, that person is a coach. In an academic setting, that person is a student, that person is a professor or a teacher, and they generally have separate credentials for that. We don't really do that in the martial arts world much. Some schools do, most do not. And I found that because of some of my other interests, I was teaching people in ways that most martial arts schools weren't. And I said, okay, wait a second. What if I lean into this? What if we bring forward the way people learn, the more modern understanding of the way people learn, especially the way they learn physical disciplines, physical movement? What if I focused on that? And so that became the focus of what I was traveling and lecturing and teaching on. And I found that I would get people for an hour or two, and they would make rapid progress in just a couple hours. These are people who've been training for a long time. I said, wait a second. What if I took this stuff and I built a school around it? And that question wouldn't leave. And I had that question for years. And I said, okay, it's time to do something with this question.
So what does that look like? What can you give an example of what?
Yeah. So if you look at the way people learn things, and if anybody out there listening is involved in public education, you probably, if I say, think of the child in your class who has a difficult home life, you know that that child is very difficult to teach. Because one of the prerequisites for someone to learn something is safety. If I put you in an environment where it's loud and chaotic and you are fearful for your life, I can rattle off a list of numbers to you and ask you to memorize them, and it's not going to happen. I could put you in a warm, quiet room and offer the same list of numbers, and you'll pick them up. In order to learn, we have to feel safe. Notice I didn't say be safe, because that's not necessarily the same thing. But in order for people to learn, they have to feel safe. Without that feeling of safety, they don't learn. And if we think about it, that's kind of hardwired into us. In fact, it is very much hardwired into us. What is the prime driver of any organism? Is to survive. Second is to procreate. In my school, we don't get into anything related to the procreation, but the survival part is pretty important to what we do. If I can't make my students feel safe, they're not going to learn. It doesn't matter how brilliant my material is. It doesn't matter how articulate or eloquent my words. It doesn't matter if we have the most credentialing, the most beautiful training space. If they don't feel safe, it all falls apart. And within the world of martial arts, there is one main thing that tends to happen that doesn't make people feel safe. And that is, we learn new material, and then we are expected to utilize it at a rather intense pace very quickly. And the example that I give, and I think I might have mentioned this in classes you were in, think of the way a baby learns to walk, stand, and then walk, and then run. There's a lot of mistakes in there, and the people around them are very encouraging. In the martial arts, in traditional martial arts, in many schools, maybe even most schools, actually, I would be confident in saying most schools, we teach the baby how to stand, and then we teach them how to walk, and then we expect them to run immediately. And it doesn't work. And so you get a lot of people who are working on these physical skill sets, and they're done so in an environment where they're training with other people. And while traditional martial arts is not necessarily violent, we are using self-defense, violence, combat, whatever word you want to throw in there, as a scenario from which to manage our training. Martial artists overall are some of the most pacifistic people I've ever met, but we still have this model of, hey, I'm gonna play around and try to hit you. Maybe I'm not trying to hit you hard, but I'm trying to hit you in such a way that these very primal aspects of your being are saying, I don't want that to happen. And it creates an environment where there's just enough question for my safety where I'm not going to implement this new material that I just learned today. I'm going to fall back on the things that I know best, which for a very long time in most schools is running away. So if you watch people when they engage one-on-one, unless they're at an incredibly low intensity, there's a whole lot of distancing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, while people are staying out of range because their desire is to remain safe.
So often when people think safety and people start thinking about and they think discipline, there's a tendency towards like the meditative practice, the person up on the mountain by himself. And one of the critiques of the person who can put themselves into a deep meditative state, and I'm not in any way criticizing this ability. I could probably stand to have more of it myself. But is that really being able to bring yourself deep into that meditative state and that parasympathetic being and doesn't necessarily, it kind of gets thrown out the window when your heart rate rises. That there actually is a lot of studies on there being two different selves, and actually our empathy, that's called hot-cold empathy, our empathy for ourselves when we're in an agitated state. We have very poor empathy when we're not in a hot state for our agitated self. And actually, the more we witness ourselves doing embarrassing behavior, the less empathy we have, not the more.
Sure. Because we have to remain the hero in our own story. And if we care a whole lot about these things that we just screwed up, well, now we might become debilitated emotionally, and we might not move forward. We may not survive so that we can procreate, right? Like if you start to look at things through this survival lens, this sort of very rudimentary evolutionary biology lens, a lot of behavior that in modern society we look at and say, that's weird, that doesn't make sense that person does that, suddenly, from my vantage, becomes much more logical.
Yeah. So you're not trained, people are still getting punches thrown at them, maybe slowly, but
generally very slowly.
So where is the line between training someone to be able to function in a sympathetic state, in an aroused, irritated state, and still making them feel safe?
Yeah. Well, the key is to recognize that as someone's familiarity with these movements increases, that the threshold where they become sympathetic changes. Right? It's not an on-off. And if you look at anybody who's done anything for a long period of time, think about driving a car, right? That's an experience most of us have had. When we started driving a car, when we got in a car the first time and we were behind the wheel, the vast majority of us, I'd say 95% plus, our heart rate went up. Does your heart rate go up when you get in the car now? Mine doesn't. I get in the car. And in fact, there are plenty of times I get in the car and my heart rate goes down because I know I don't have to worry about seeing anyone else. I can put on some tunes and I can drive, and I feel like I have much more control over my environment. The same can be said of martial arts. As we become familiar with something, as we become familiar with our body, with the way other people are likely to move, with the way I know I'm able to move safely, we can slowly turn up that intensity in lockstep with their comfort, their feeling of safety. So the intensity goes up as the threshold for what is deemed safe and unsafe it increases, it moves, and that allows people to remain training safely while increasing, say, the speed or the strength of the techniques, the complexity of the techniques. And that is all for the purpose of, if we stay below that threshold, if we keep people safe, they learn faster. This is all a really complicated way of saying we do it this way because people learn better.
So I want to get into, not immediately, but I do want to discuss, we've sort of alluded to pacifism and whether it's violent to be doing martial arts. Sure. But there's another learning style for physical education and martial arts, which is boot camp, which is certainly, I'm imagining to some degree, must be effective. Where my understanding is you're putting people in high intensity situations. There's a psychological stripping down you do of people and humiliation that comes with that, so that you can mold the soldier into what you want them to be, and sort of get rid of their old patterns and ego, one could say, and mold them into into a good officer. And people are being pushed to their extreme, and it changes people. And they become better martial artists, at least by some measures. What are you doing differently than that? And what's your critique of that?
Yeah. So the best education comes from time spent in the intersection of safety and discomfort. If I ask you to learn a new skill, if I teach you a new kick or punch, if you're in a safe environment, well, I'm asking you to do this new thing, this thing you are uncomfortable with by definition because it's new, that's the sweet spot for learning. If I say, okay, Irvin, you're stupid, I hate you, and I'm yelling at you, and there are other people yelling at you, and you have to question whether or not you are safe in this environment. And I will tie this back to your example of the military in a moment. If you're in that environment, you have to find a way to carve out your own feeling of safety. It is an incredibly, I would say, advanced teaching approach to push someone so far that they are over the line and they have to surrender to the process. Now, why does that generally happen in a military setting? Because there's no exit, because you can't quit. And because on some level, the people who choose to engage in that environment, we don't have a draft right now. 100% of the soldiers who are enlisting are choosing to enlist. They're choosing to go through that environment. And I've got to say the vast majority know that they're going to go into something like this, right? Like I've never served. And if I say Marine drill sergeant, you have a vision of what that is from discussions with people or TV and movies, right? We all have some idea of what that archetype looks like. If I'm one of those folks, I know that the military doesn't want to chew me up and spit me out unsafe because that's a waste of their resources. So I may not agree with their methods, especially in the moment, but you talked about it in a very important way. Those folks are getting broken down so they can be rebuilt in a certain way that the military needs them to be. If they're going to be soldiers, they have to be conditioned to follow orders. Now, a lot of the traditional martial arts that was brought back from China, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, through U.S. military involvement was brought back, the vast majority was brought back by folks who served in the military. So they did bring in a lot of this kind of militaristic hierarchy in some of these approaches that, interestingly enough, is not done everywhere where these sorts of training environments exist. But I don't believe it's the most efficient way to get to the goal. Now, if the goal was, I want to set you up to be a soldier, or the goal was, I want to turn you into a professional fighter, these methods may not be the best way. But those are not my experiences. I can't speak to those. I can only speculate. What I can speak to is I have seen hundreds, if not thousands of people over my lifetime become better versions of themselves through martial arts, and along the way, gain some competency in protecting themselves from physical violence.
So the goals that you have for the first part of what you said, better version of themselves, and you've talked about health a lot. There are some people who might like a lot of what you said, but have no desire to be able to be in a fight or to be able to defend themselves in a fight. That part just doesn't appeal to them, and they're like, well, this isn't for me. They probably haven't listened this far into the episode, to be perfectly honest.
Probably not.
But what for that person, is there still a benefit to martial arts versus a yoga class or rowing lessons or one of the many other physical activities out there? Is there still a benefit unique to martial arts for that person?
I would say so, and we'll tackle the why I think that assessment might be a bit irresponsible. I won't say wrong, but I would say irresponsible. How many people are enrolling their children in yoga classes for discipline, in rowing classes for discipline? Now, I'm a huge fan of movement. I mean, that's probably the first subject you and I connected on, was a mutual admiration for movement in various forms. I've taught everything from parkour to gymnastics to CrossFit. I've done some personal training. I've guided people hiking. Like, I've done a lot of interesting and varied movement related modalities. I love movement. I think the human body's awesome. I think people would benefit from moving it more. But if we go back to that model, safety and discomfort, that's where benefit exists. How do we create lasting benefit? Within safety, we find the discomfort. We do it for frequently and over a period of time, frequency and duration. If you look at all physical pursuits, that's how you create adaptation. Okay, you can even create adaptation mentally and emotionally using that very simple model. It probably exists elsewhere. I'm unaware of it. I think it's mine. We'll find out. I'll either write a book and then somebody will sue me, or they won't. But if you look at your typical movement modalities outside of martial arts, you don't have a lot of the discomfort. People don't tend to push themselves unless they're in an environment that is safe to do so. Now, there are plenty of people who do hot yoga, right? That's a great example of a yoga discipline that starts to get some of these similar benefits around discipline. You have to go. If you don't go, you don't do yoga. So I know it's going to be hot. I know it's going to be difficult, but I want to go. I like the way I feel after. Whatever it is that you say to yourself, there's a lot of that in there. But one of the things that is really different about traditional martial arts versus a lot of these other modalities is you're doing it by yourself, but you're also training with other people. Now, sometimes those other people are just next to you, but quite often you are doing some of this work with other people, right? A lot of the drills that we do, you have to have a partner. And it is in that work that a huge amount of the benefit comes in, because if I'm a poor partner for you, you're likely to be a poor partner for me. We don't benefit as much. I have to find a way to trust you, because even if you're moving slowly and gently, you're still punching and kicking near my body. Maybe we're even doing a drill where you're making contact. And over time, as comfort and that line for what becomes unsafe starts to move further away, we're punching and kicking faster and maybe a little harder. And so without that trust, without having built that discipline, that self-understanding, that stuff doesn't work. It happens innately in that process.
So could you speak to the violence and pacifism? Because I feel like we've sort of talked around that a little bit.
Sure. I'm not going to tell anybody what their definition of pacifism is. My definition of pacifism, I avoid violence at all costs. That does not mean that there is not a situation where violence is warranted. If someone is trying to kill me, I think most people would agree that's a time where violence is warranted. There are extreme pacifists who do not agree with that. They would just surrender. That's fine. Good on you. I'm going to protect myself. I'm also going to protect the people around me, the people that I love. If those people happen to have children, I'm going to protect those children. And there's an instinct that comes up for most parents that I think starts to draw the line of where pacifism is, right? You have a child. Mm-hmm. You've probably had some things pop up where you've noticed, I've heard, I don't have children of my own, but I have heard plenty of parents say this, that early on, there were things where someone would look at their child and they would feel an emotional response that they'd never felt before. Now, I don't know if you've had that experience, but I suspect some in the audience have. So, you know what I'm talking about. There's a line. A lot of people think martial arts is inherently violent. My definition of martial arts is personal growth through the training of hand-to-hand combat. What are the first two words in there? Personal growth. If you break down the term martial art, what is the noun? Art. It is an artistic pursuit done through the training for and implementation of mock combat. It is not what you see on TV. It is not fight scenes. We do not avenge our instructor's disrespect from so-and-so across the globe and train 7 years and, go kick palm trees to avenge them. Like that's not how this stuff really works. So when people say, I'm not going to do martial arts because I'm a pacifist, it suggests to me that they either have a very poor relationship with martial arts because maybe they engaged with a school that was not for them, because martial arts schools can be all manner of things, or they just have ideas that they've constructed based on TV movies and maybe hearing what some other folks had said, and they're inaccurate.
So we've talked about feeling safe, about sort of pushing the line. We've talked about discipline, educational models. One thing that I know that is part of your practice and you often speak to is having fun.
Yeah. How do kids learn? Right. And so you're probably, folks in the audience, you're probably seeing a pattern here. I took a big step back and I said, how do people learn? Yes, I was brought up. I have some skills that I'm very proud of. I've had some experiences I'm very proud of. And those came from traditional martial arts being taught in a certain way. And I do not begrudge any of it. But I'm always asking, how can I make this better? So I took a big step back and I said, how do people learn? Well, what's universal among most young, regardless of species? They learn through play. You've got a kid, your kid learns a heck of a lot from playing. And then I said, okay, does that apply as adults? No. I learn the most when I'm enjoying what I'm doing. And I started digging around, doing a little bit of light research. Yeah, we learn best when we have fun. So I make sure that my students have fun and they learn something. And my priorities are in that order. Because if they have, let's say someone has a bad class, right? They show up to class, their brain is full of all sorts of things from the day. Maybe there's challenges with family or with their job, with their body. And they're just not in a place to get new information that day. Well, I can at least give them an enjoyable time, and then they'll show up next time. And then I'll teach them something that time. Not to say I'm not trying to teach them, but I recognize that not everybody's coming in at their best every class. If I go the boot camp model and say, regardless of where you're at today, I'm going to cram knowledge into your brain. First off, that doesn't work. Again, talk to a public school teacher. You can't make anyone learn. Two, if I do that too often or too intensely, they don't show up again, and then I have no opportunity to teach them more.
Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to hear. So I've been thinking about teaching a class at some point called Adults at Play. I really play
We've
is
talked
one of
about that.
Yeah, and play is one of the fundamental areas of occupation. As an occupational therapist, there's 7 categories of occupation, and play is a category. And somehow it's sometimes split away from leisure. And there's sometimes this idea that adults do leisure, which implies sort of more study and contemplation, and maybe putting the worm on the hook when you don't like. You like fishing overall, but you don't actually like putting the worm on the hook, but that's what you do because you're an adult. Whereas play has a spontaneous component to it, and that's for children. Now, most OTs have moved beyond that and acknowledged that play is also for adults, but there's something unsophisticated about play and silly and childish about play.
Yeah.
And I really want to sort of buck that's how we learn new things, is in a creative way, is sort of and break down our preconceived notions, is to play with them. And
I love that you used the example of fishing and putting a worm on the hook, because even in the that version of quote play, even if we call it leisure, even if it's play, there still has to be something we dislike about it, right? Like, in order for me to justify this thing I find enjoyable, there has to be a part that I hate, right? The best martial arts instructors are funny. They're playful. They are maybe not childish, but childlike. And it's something that I've spent a lot of time over the years. What for folks who don't know, which is probably the majority of folks paying attention to this, I have a martial arts podcast. We're in our 9th year. What did we release? Like episode 867 today. So got a little bit of time with podcasting, and we've had some wonderful guests over the years, and we also tackle topics. And one of the subjects that came up often, probably in years like 3 and 4, was the verb that people were associating with martial arts. And there wasn't consensus. I do karate. I train taekwondo, and those are interchangeable. I practice martial arts. Yeah, those work, but they're not encompassing. And then I had a guest on the show, and I'm embarrassed that I've forgotten this person's name, but with 800 plus episodes, maybe I get a little bit of grace for this. And this person strongly advocated for using the word play as the verb. I play martial arts. And initially I was resistant. And I said, wait a second. When kids play, they're all in. They commit. It is more difficult to get a child away from playing than it is to get any adult away from their job. And then you look at, okay, well, what about other high-level physical pursuits? People play basketball, they play soccer, they play tennis. Okay, well, that's not disrespectful. LeBron James, they play musical instruments, right? And the best of the best make a lot of money doing these things, and we don't bat an eye at calling it play. And that really started to change my approach. And so that is the verb that I use now. I play martial arts. We play karate. Now, I don't generally use that word publicly because, as you said, that word has a stigma. And eventually I would like to help you change that stigma. Because we all deserve play. We all deserve to have something that makes us smile, that helps us learn. Right? If you ask a kid to play something that they have played a bunch, and they have developed a strong level of competency, and there is no longer a challenge, that kid's going to go find something else. Because play is inherently an educational model. It's how we understand our world.
And I was thinking about this, that any animal that, be it a predator or prey animal, that has to learn how to survive, either by eating or by running away, that's what their play mostly consists of.
Yeah.
So that is their martial art, is play.
Absolutely. It's, if you can find a way to make whatever you are learning fun, you're going to spend more time with it, and your brain is going to be more receptive for it. If you think about the things that you like best, the things you choose to spend the time on, you know them better than most of the other things that you have spent the same amount of time not enjoying. This is the argument for less conventional homeschooling, unschooling sort of approach. That if you're interested in something, you're going to immerse in it, you're going to take things away, it's all going to work out. I am not, my knowledge in terms of education, I'm going to draw a hard line at the boundaries of martial arts. I can teach you martial arts. I can teach you how to teach martial arts. I'm not saying how you should teach your kids math. But because of that observation, and that observation of the world and the research that I've done, I lead with fun. I make sure that my classes are fun. And I do that through tone, and I do that through giving people the ability to make mistakes without feeling judged, right? It goes back to the safety part. I crack jokes. And I make sure that when people are working with each other, that they feel that there's a bit of open space for them to engage and smile and laugh with each other when something silly happens, because there's too much seriousness in the world. Why do I want to suppress the organic fun that people are having when they come and they choose to do this thing?
So I'm not positive I'm remembering everything that we said in the podcast right now, but I think that we have not said actually what type of martial arts you teach at Central Vermont Martial Arts.
So I when people say what kind of martial arts do you do, I begrudgingly say karate, because karate was my first martial art. Specifically, I grew up with two instructors who came from two different karate pursuits, Kyokushinkai and Isshinryu karate, one being mainland Japan style, one being an Okinawan style. If you know martial arts, you know that there's some flavor variations, much in the way that cuisine has regions. And their stylistic influences became my language, not just for martial arts, but for movement. And it's interesting, if you talk to most people, the first martial art they train in becomes their understanding of every other martial art. It becomes their language. It's their accent, right? You have some Aikido background. It doesn't take very many people much time to see you move and say, this guy's done something else before. And if I had someone hanging around class that had done some Aikido, they'd probably be able to see that in your karate movements, right? So I call it karate, but after I went to college, I started doing a bunch of other things. I've got experience, some experience at least in everything from like judo and jiu-jitsu and capoeira to taekwondo and kickboxing, and I've played with bits here and there of a lot of other things. To me, it's all movement. Right? One of the quotes that I don't want to say I'm famous for, but in the martial arts world, one of the quotes that when it ends up posted on our social media, it gets shared around quite a bit, is there are only so many ways to move the human body, and only some of them make sense in the context of combat. And if martial arts is training for mock combat, or at least through that kind of ideology, then we're not going to do things that would get us hurt. We're not going to do things that are foolish because someone, it sets someone up to easily punch or kick us. So whether it's karate or taekwondo or aikido, yeah, there's the core elements to those martial arts are very different, but as you progress in them, the differences between them actually shrink. A number of folks have put forward this metaphor that I like very much, the idea that all martial arts are climbing the same mountain. And when you start at the bottom, the distance from one to the other is quite far, but as you progress, the distance between them becomes much smaller. And I think that that's very true, right? And so roughly, I think a third, maybe even half of our class has some level of prior training. And I don't discount that. Some of them we gotta gently and playfully and metaphorically hit them with a stick and say, no, you got to move your leg or your hand in this way. You got to move a little bit differently to get with what we're doing here. But I don't suggest that what they've done prior is incorrect or without value.
I can speak to that personally, that I felt like my expression, having a background in Aikido, is welcome in the class. My accent is welcome, except for when it becomes problematic. So I will not, if you're throwing a kick, I'm not going, my instinct is to go, okay, let's blend with this leg, and which results in me grabbing a leg, and that's not safe for much of the levels of practice that I've engaged with.
Not yet. We'll get there, but not yet. Yeah. It's, if I was to take all the stuff that I've learned from all the different schools that I've trained in, and even the things that I love, the curriculum would be massive. And one of my other epiphanies that coalesced to form this school was, the more I asked people to learn, the less competent they will be at any one of those things. If I ask someone to memorize 20 forms for their black belt, and for those who may not know, in karate, we call them kata, but just kind of generically across martial arts, we call them forms. And you could think of it as like a martial arts dance routine, right? It's generally done solo, though there are some partner sets. And it's a sequence of movements, and they are meant to be memorized and practiced in that order. If I ask you to memorize 20 versus 10 versus 5, you're going to know the 5 better than you know the 20. So I should only give you more than 5 if there's something lacking in the 5 that I think is critical. And there was a lot of decision process as I put together the school. How do I strip curriculum back to the bare minimum that people need? And we have the smallest curriculum of any martial arts school I've ever seen. It's also part of why I think people are progressing so rapidly and with extreme competence.
Can you speak a little more to that small curriculum? Like,
sure.
What does that look like, and a little more to the why?
Yeah. So if we go back to what I said, there's only so many ways the human body can move. In a lot of martial arts schools, you would be taught, okay, this technique comes in, someone tries to throw a punch at you. I want you to do this defense. And then they practice that a bunch. But what happens when that punch is at a slightly different height or angle, or you're in a slightly different stance, or the orientation between the two people training is different? Is that defense, that block, still the best way? Probably not. So instead of saying, if this, then that, I incorporate freeform movement, again, slowly, because it's safe, as early as possible. Most people are doing this day one. If someone slowly throws a punch at your face, you're probably going to push it out of the way. We call that a block, or you're probably going to move out of the way. Those are both great options. I don't need to micromanage that. So my role is to give people ingredients. This is kind of newer language for me, to give people ingredients and a safe kitchen to cook in. And you're deciding how you want to cook your dish. You decide what ingredients go in. You're probably going to end up with, 80% the same as the person next to you. But that 20% is really interesting. And that becomes a great opportunity for you with your Aikido background, or for, the other person next to you with their taekwondo background, to incorporate some of the things that they love that aren't part of the curriculum. And it allows for individualization, because let's face it, our bodies are different. You and I are actually, of all the people in the class, we're probably built most similarly, and we're still different in how our bodies move. I don't want to tell people to move like me. I don't want to tell people how they have to move most of the time. I'm going to give you those ingredients, and I'm going to give you a safe environment to experiment in, because there's a lot of experimentation in play, right? Kids love experimenting. They figure things out. If you can give them a space to do it safely, they pick up things really quickly. If a really gentle punch is coming to someone's face, there's enough reptile brain stuff going on there to go, I need to do something about this. And they move it away. And over time, they start to process the information that's available to them, because we're picking up information constantly, and they're building patterns. They're noticing things on a subconscious level, unconscious level, and they're building those patterns, and they start moving, and they don't even realize what they're doing. They're not thinking about every move in rather short order. They're just responding to what's happening.
So if you had one brief statement you could make about your school when someone's describing it, your elevator pitch, so to speak, what are you telling someone about your curriculum, and why they should care about going to your school?
We prioritize fun, safety, and simplicity, not only because that creates a more enjoyable experience, but it creates a more effective experience. I just came up with that on the fly.
Well, I think that's a great note to go out on.
Yeah.
Thank you
that
so
wasn't
much
bad.
thank you so much for coming on today, Jeremy. It was fun
Thanks for
talking
having
with
me.
you about this.
Yeah, anytime.
Thank you for listening to Resilience Radio. This particular episode is may come off as a little more promotional, and that's due to my own connection with the Central Vermont Martial Arts Dojo and my own desire to have more people to practice with. So you can check the show notes for links to Central Vermont Martial Arts, and come check us out there and come take a class. I believe the first class is always free. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes again for full credits on that. I hope you enjoyed. Take care.